Distinguished guests and fellow colleagues, welcome to today's CLC lecture series. My name is Jean, and I'm from the Center for Liveable Cities. Now, some of you may know CLC as a knowledge center jointly established by the Ministry of National Development and the Ministry of Environment and Water Resources in 2008. Now, our CLC's mission is to distill, create, and share knowledge on livable and sustainable cities. And the center's work spans three main areas: research, capacity development, as well as promotions. Now, the CLC lecture series provides a platform for urban thought leaders and experts to exchange views and share knowledge. Now, in today's session, we are very honored to have with us Professor Susan Fainstein, Senior Research Fellow at the Graduate School of Design at Harvard University. The lecture will examine the different approaches to planning a city, taking examples from New York and Amsterdam. Now, the format for today's lecture will start off with Professor Susan Fainstein making a short presentation, and this will be followed by a Q&A session with the audience. And this will be moderated by Mr. Donald Loh, Senior Fellow and Assistant Dean of Research Centers at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. And Donald is also a Research Director at Associate Director at CLC. With this, let us start the session by inviting Professor Fainstein on stage. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. I am so delighted to be here and flattered that you should invite me. And let's see what I can do about this. Okay. So the talk I'm going to give today is based on a book that I published a couple of years ago called The Just City, published by Cornell University Press. The purpose of the book was to say what would be a just city within the constraints that we have in the world right now of globalization, of global capitalism. So the question that underlay the book, and which I want to address in my talk today, is what principles should guide us when we formulate plans and policies based on the principle of justice. The principle of justice is not the same as the principle of competitiveness. Part of the reason that I wrote this book was because when I've been in planning discussions, when I've been in teaching formats, when I've been here, what everybody talks about all the time is how can we be more competitive? How can we be a global city? But being more competitive or being a global city does not necessarily mean that it's a more just city, or necessarily mean that it's a city where the quality of life for the majority of inhabitants is everything that one might desire. On the other hand, we're not going to have a utopia. We're not going to probably change the structure of the global economy. So what is realistic to talk about? When I started this research, which has now been going on for more than a decade, I decided I'd always taught planning. I'd majored in political science as an undergraduate, but I hadn't really studied philosophy. So I looked at philosophers to figure out what it is I meant if I was talking about a more just city. Then the thing about philosophy as a discipline is that philosophers feel fairly free to argue logically, but they don't really feel compelled to say, well, what would I do in the real circumstances that people who are planning face? I do recall being in a lecture that one very well-known philosopher gave. At the end, I raised my hand and asked her a question. I said, is that really practical? She said, well, I don't have to worry about that. I'm a philosopher. So there's a problem here of how do you translate principles of justice to the real world, and particularly to the urban world. Now, in one way, some of the things I have to say don't apply entirely to Singapore, which is a city-state, so that Singapore has much more control over its destiny than do the cities of countries where they have to deal with a rural hinterland, with the politics of many different cities, with competition from cities within the same country. Here, you're it. And that does give you much more discretion, I think. At any rate, from reading philosophy, I came up with 3 principles as the guiding principles for a just city. The principles of equity, democracy, and diversity. These were derived from the works of a number of philosophers, most preeminently, I suppose, John Rawls. My choice of the word equity rather than equality is in fact based on Rawls's argument that a policy ought to distribute benefits to people where the worst off become better off. So the worst off don't have to become equal to everybody else, but no policy should in fact make those who are most disadvantaged more disadvantaged. And it means that we have to talk about the policy at the time it's being enacted. To say, well, we have to make our city more competitive because sometime in the by and by, the benefits will trickle down to those people who are worst off, doesn't justify making them worst off at the time. We have a lot of examples in the world of people whose homes were destroyed in the name of the greater good and said, well, eventually they will benefit. But equity means that you do not, in fact, take advantage of those people who are weakest. Now, my book doesn't deal, except peripherally, with sustainability, which is right now perhaps the buzzword in policy circles. And I don't deal with it for a couple of reasons. One is because everybody else does, so it didn't seem like I was going to make a substantial contribution. But beyond that, the term sustainability tends to be stretched to cover anything that people wish to justify in terms of urban policy. So you're certainly welcome in the Q&A to raise questions about sustainability, but that isn't, at any rate, my focus. And I want to emphasize that competitiveness is not one of the criteria by which I evaluate urban policy. The examples I draw are from 3 cities, New York, Amsterdam, and Singapore. I'm a little shy, hesitant perhaps about discussing Singapore, since all of you know more about Singapore than I do, but it presents such an interesting contrast to Western cities in terms of planning and policy that I think it's worth my talking about. I focus on a particular kind of policy, that of redevelopment planning and development planning. Redevelopment planning, replanning an area where there already is habitation and commercial development, presents many more issues than just development planning when you're talking about physical planning, because there's always an affected population, either of business owners or of residents, who will be affected by what you're doing. And if what you're doing is tearing down structures, it's somebody's structure that's being torn down. Or if what you're doing is building a highway, that highway is going to affect the people who live around it. So redevelopment planning inevitably raises issues which are politicized. So, as well as discussing what should be the content of plans, I want to discuss the organization of politics and planning. Planning is not simply a technical occupation, it's a political occupation. That planning affects who wins and who loses within the structure of within the physical and social structure and economic structure of a city. If you decide that you're going to target high finance, that means that you're looking at a different kind of population and different set of incentives and different kind of building type than if you're going to target manufacturing or high tech. So that all of this is connected with different interests in society, and it always has financial benefits and territorial benefits to certain groups and not to other groups. So what I want to do then is examine the range of processes and outcomes in different cities, so as to look at what is possible. I wrote, the title of this talk is something like, Can We Make the Cities We Want? And I originally wrote an article with that title before I wrote my book. What I argued in that article was the early planners had a kind of utopian vision. Planners like Ebenezer Howard or Le Corbusier, this is what the ideal city should look like. I think that you have to have an ideal, you have to have a goal, but that it's perhaps more realistic to say, let's look around the world and see what cities most represent whatever it is I'm trying to achieve, and then hold up those cities as models for others. This isn't to say you can just take a best practice and replicate it here and there, because every context is different, but nevertheless, a more realistic utopianism is one that starts out by saying, what have we got out there? What is possible? And what is possible under the kinds of economic conditions that exist in the world? So first, New York is the city I know best. It's the city I've lived in. I've taught at Columbia. New York represents a really interesting case in terms of my three criteria of democracy, diversity, and equity. New York has very high levels of participation, a very active political sphere. It is organized so that it has community boards, so that it's divided up into, one couldn't call them neighborhoods because each community board has a district of from 150,000 to 200,000 people, but nevertheless it's broken up into these districts, and each district has a community board. Any major land use decision within that district must pass through the community board. But in addition, there's a huge amount of activity within civil society, of community groups, community-based development organizations, community development corporations, political party organizations, lots of different entities which try to represent the locality in which a plan is being administered. So whenever something is proposed, you get an immediate reaction. If there isn't an already existing group around that plan, one will certainly come into being. There's been a big project, which I will talk about again later, called Atlantic Yards in Brooklyn, New York. Well, it has fomented an enormous amount of discussion and debate. It has caused the development of groups both pro and con. It has gone through the courts, and one of the aspects that's particularly the case in New York and not the case here is that virtually any proposal for a large development becomes challenged within the judicial system, where there are various laws, particularly having to do with environmental damage that can be used to block developments. The most famous of these in New York was the case where they wanted to build an expressway along the Hudson River. It was challenged on the basis of an aquatic entity known as the snail darter, and it was stopped because essentially it said that the habitats for the breeding of, I forget which kind of fish, were going to be destroyed. But whatever, they stopped it just based on this aspect of environmental law. This high level of participation and contestation, however, does not necessarily result in democratic outcomes, if you mean outcomes that benefit the majority of people, and it rarely reaches a consensus that finally somebody prevails or something is simply blocked. New York has a very mixed record in terms of how one would evaluate the outcomes of planning in relation to my three criteria. It certainly is diverse. There is a continuous flow of immigrants. Nearly 40% of the population is foreign-born. Unlike other parts of the United States, there's relatively little opposition to immigration. A lot of the immigrants are not legal, they're undocumented. The mayors of New York have been willing to give benefits to undocumented immigrants and have been unwilling to enforce immigration law in terms of turning them in or trying to get them out. On the other hand, the city is rather weak in terms of ensuring equity. At one time, New York was perhaps the most liberal, in the American sense of the term, city in the United States. It certainly has built more public housing than any other city. It was once called a union city, and it was very heavily unionized. It was a working class city for a very long time, but that is no longer the case. Most of the projects that go on now, the big planning projects, are directed at making the city, quote, competitive, which essentially means giving subsidies to private developers and especially to baseball teams. It does have, as I said, a substantial amount of public housing. It has 17% of rental units are public housing units, which is vastly more than any other city has to offer, even though compared to HDB housing in Singapore, and I might note that public housing in New York is entirely rental, none of it's owner-occupied, but also as compared to Amsterdam. And in fact, as compared to most Western European cities, the United States in general has much less in the way of public housing, and New York, next to Paris or Berlin or Amsterdam or any of the Northern European cities, supplies substantially less housing that's affordable based on public investment. There is a major emphasis in the city on so-called mega projects, that is, very large projects, which these days combine commercial, residential, and office, which in the past tended to be monofunctional, but it's now become mixed use has become the popular thing. And so we have somewhat different types of big projects than in the past, but we have a number of them. And then in particular, there's been a great deal of investment in sports venues. The argument seems to be that you aren't an important city unless you have a new modern football stadium, baseball stadium, and in the case of New York, we're talking 2 baseball stadiums. The public sector has mainly financed these endeavors, even though the proceeds from them go to the private sector. So we have the richest team in baseball getting a brand new stadium, which has cost the public sector something like $1 billion. Why isn't this? Here, a second. I can't, there we go. Okay, so this is an example of public housing. This is Coney Island, New York. This is on the very periphery of Brooklyn, which, if you know the geography of New York, is to the south of Manhattan. The people who live in this housing actually get a nice view of the Atlantic Ocean. The buildings are stark. This is characteristic of American public housing. In fact, this building type you can find in a great many cities. The objective of building buildings that didn't look nice was quite simply to say that these buildings were for people who couldn't find any place else to live. It's quite different from the view of HDB here. This was very much under the pressure of the real estate industry in the United States, which, when the public housing program was passed in 1949, they were very strongly opposed. They did not want competition from publicly subsidized housing, and the final agreement within the U.S. Congress was that it should be only for those people who were less eligible, who could only afford public housing. And it shouldn't be so nice that they would really want to stay there if they could go somewhere else. Public housing has a very bad reputation in the United States. It's usually called the projects. And people are embarrassed to say that they live in the projects. Very little money is allocated for upkeep, and so much of it has deteriorated. Then the argument goes, well, you can see how bad public housing is because look how terrible it looks and look at the kind of people who live there. But of course, this is circular. If you'd made it better to begin with, and if you'd provided upkeep, and if you'd let people stay in it if they, as their incomes grew, then in fact you would have something that people could in fact be proud of. So that there was a deliberate intention to make it undesirable. In contrast to public housing, Columbus Center is a relatively recent mega project. It did provoke a great deal of controversy. It was right on the edge of Central Park in the South End. Among those who originally opposed it was Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis, because the wealthy people who lived around the park did not like the idea that it would cast shadows on Central Park. And they were a fairly potent constituency, and so the design was redone. So instead of a single tower, there were two towers. So what's in this structure? Well, on the bottom is a very high-end shopping center, and it would actually look quite familiar to those of you who've been to Marina Sands, because it's kind of the same set of stores. And one of the things that to me is mysterious is why Cartier or Fendi or whatever, why it matters to you whether you bought whatever your purse in Singapore or in New York or in Paris or in all the different places these identical stores are located. So we have high-end chain stores and low-end chain stores around the world, which are remarkably the same. At any rate, in the bottom of this, and also like the Singapore model, and very unusual for New York, there is actually a supermarket in the basement, which you do not usually find in Manhattan office or in Manhattan buildings. At any rate, above the shopping mall is a restaurant floor, which has the most expensive restaurants in New York. And then that sort of blockish building to the right is an office building. And then the towers, or no, that's the Mandarin Oriental Hotel. And then the towers are condominiums and among the most expensive in the world. So this was a mega development which is entirely oriented toward the rich. There is nothing for low-income people. The argument, of course, justifying it is, well, this is a very desirable site. It will end up bringing a lot of revenue into the city, and then ultimately the low-income people of New York will benefit, but ultimately may never, in fact, come. This is what's my particular pet peeve, Yankee Stadium. As I mentioned before, this is the New York Yankees are the richest team in baseball. They have they get billions of dollars from the broadcast rights. The players make $20 million a year or whatever. That is, they have the richest players, the richest team, the richest broadcast rights, but they felt that the old Yankee Stadium was really too seedy for them, and they needed a new one. So they persuaded the city to build them a new one. Now, the city didn't pay for it directly. They paid for it indirectly. They gave them the land, which used to be a public park. Then the city then had to go out and buy other land to replace the missing parkland, because by law you can't diminish the total amount of parkland. But the first park was a very popular one and very well located, and the new ones, that's less the case. But it turned out to be very expensive. Then the Metropolitan Transportation Authority had to build a railroad station for it. So altogether, the public contribution, which didn't actually go to physically build the stadium, it just went to produce the infrastructure and land for the stadium, did add up to close to $1 billion, and the Yankees can proudly say, oh, we paid for it ourselves. Now, what the Yankees then do is they give the city, they don't pay any property tax, they give the city something called a payment in lieu of taxes, or a pilot, and the payment in lieu of taxes goes to pay off, in fact, the bonds that they borrowed on to build the stadium itself. So essentially, it's cost-free for the Yankees. This is the High Line, and it's been the most popular public amenity that the city has built maybe in the last number of years. And this is something that now you, with the Malayan Railroad, are attempting to emulate, and in fact it's been emulated in many places around the world. It was an old railroad old railroad line that ran along the western edge of Manhattan. The previous mayor before Bloomberg, Mayor Giuliani, thought that doing anything with it was a waste of money and they should tear it down. But a citizens group mobilized to prevent its demolition, and under Mayor Bloomberg, it was redone, it was planted, and it has become not only an enormous tourist attraction, but it has been the stimulus for billions of dollars. It's estimated $6 billion worth of investment in the area, which investment came in totally by the private sector without having to be subsidized by the city. So this relatively small investment produced a huge economic multiplier. And this is the picture that was on the poster for this talk. This is a part of the High Line that widens out. New York, as I mentioned earlier, scores well on diversity. What you get around the city are these various enclaves of different ethnic groups. So Jackson Heights, Queens is an Indian enclave, that is East Indian, also South American. And when you're there, you're really transported to another world in terms of shops, in terms of restaurants, in terms of the people who live there. And this has been a tradition in New York. New York, since the 19th century, has quite easily absorbed immigrants, and there's relatively little antagonism to them. And in fact, immigration has in certain ways saved the city. The city lost population in the 60s and 70s. So there were vacant storefronts all over. There were schools that were closed. There were empty buildings. Notoriously, the South Bronx burned up. And then subsequently, it has become refilled. And all these areas outside of Manhattan have become refilled really by people from other countries who not only have populated it, but have started all kinds of small businesses, which are patronized by, one of the things about New Yorkers, even working class New Yorkers, is they're really kind of sophisticated. And one sees Irish cops using chopsticks in Korean restaurants, that it's a place where there is a great deal of heterogeneity, and heterogeneity is by and large accepted. Now, Amsterdam is the city that I've used always as the closest to my model city, to the city that most embodies these three criteria, these three principles of democracy, diversity, and equity. I first started going to Amsterdam in the 1970s. I had my first sabbatical. I was an assistant professor. And the question I had then, and it's the question that's really driven my research throughout my life, is what can be done realistically? What can be done within the confines of the existing world economy? And we're talking the 1970s, when the countries were much more autonomous than they are now, when the term globalization was not yet on the tip of everyone's tongue. So I thought I would go to Sweden, because Sweden was the country that had been touted as the most egalitarian. But I had a student who was Dutch, and he said, no, don't go to Sweden, go to Amsterdam. Amsterdam's much more interesting. Besides, he said, you can stay with my parents and we'll show you around. So I thought, okay, I'll go to Amsterdam, but a place about which I knew absolutely nothing and had never been. But it turned out that Amsterdam, in fact, did represent a spectrum of possibility that wasn't elsewhere, and certainly wasn't in Sweden at the time, because Amsterdam has always been a very diverse city. It was a trading city. It was one of the ports of Europe. It was a place where refugees came from countries where they had been driven out, where Huguenots, where Jews, Puritans, various groups over the years had come because there was a tradition of tolerance. So this tradition of tolerance remains part of Amsterdam. It also has a very strong tradition of participation, that as in New York, no plan goes undiscussed, and there is a very strong group interjection whenever there is a plan, but somewhat different from New York. It doesn't result in the kind of stalemate that we tend to get in the United States. The Dutch believe in consensus, and they negotiate, and eventually they do tend to reach a consensus. So there is participation, and there is consensus. There has been, however, a retreat recently from the very high degree of democratization that they had in Amsterdam. They had divided Amsterdam into small districts, of which each had its own board of aldermen and its own little mayor and its own discussion of every kind of planning policy. But the most recent government has in fact withdrawn this district form of government. Amsterdam does have high ethnic diversity. It successfully absorbed, after the independence of the Dutch colonies, it allowed all colonials who wanted to move to the Netherlands to do so. And it's quite successfully absorbed the the Indonesians and the Surinamers who came there, but there is a fair amount of friction in relationship to the Muslim population. The Netherlands had guest workers, and like Germany, they came predominantly from Muslim countries, and there has been recently a great deal of anti-Muslim sentiment, particularly anti-Moroccans and Turks, and these are the groups that have been least well absorbed into the population of Amsterdam. It is relatively easy to become a Dutch citizen, in contrast to, for example, either Germany or Singapore. Asylum seekers are, if not welcome, they're allowed in, and they are allowed to gain citizenship upon learning the Dutch language and passing certain tests. The government of the Netherlands itself has been dominated by left-wing governments, and the government of Amsterdam has been run by Social Democrats for a very long time. There has been a very strong commitment to social housing, so that for quite a long period, 90% of the housing units built in Amsterdam were in fact in forms of public housing. However, in the last 10 years, there's been a strong move toward the market, a feeling that middle-class people and young professionals couldn't find a place to live in Amsterdam because they would be stuck on housing waiting lists. The housing that was owned by the municipality was turned over to non-profit housing associations, which now have the responsibility for building housing. They have to finance it based on their own assets, and so this has meant really a stall in terms of building new housing. And one of the consequences, one that perhaps is familiar to you, is a housing shortage at most levels of income within the city. Now I want to show you some pictures of Amsterdam. New Market is an interesting story, and it's an interesting planning story. It's an old market building right in the heart of the city. Under one of the governments, one of the post-war governments during the 80s, they decided that they ought to run a highway and subway through the center of this area, knock down the building, modernize, and build new modern buildings, tear down the buildings around the periphery. There was huge uproar, riots, people, and one of the things now that's interesting, if you go into the subway station or the underground or whatever you want to call it, is that there are huge photo murals on the walls of people being beat on the head by police with truncheons, of students being arrested, but they did succeed in stopping it, and they succeeded in stopping it not just through discussion, but actually through putting their bodies on the line. And Amsterdam, being the kind of place it is, the planning department said, oh dear, well, we probably shouldn't have done that, it was the wrong thing, and we will even memorialize your protest by putting pictures on the wall. Which makes it a very unusual place, I think you would have to say. This was a huge public housing development on the periphery called the Bommermeer. It was developed in the Corbusian manner. Rather than being towers in the Singapore model, it was more these very elongated, very large buildings. The planners of Amsterdam thought that this would be really good for people and they would love it because the apartments were bigger than what they had in the center of the city. But it turns out nobody did love it at all. The Dutch have a certain idea of what's nice. They have a word that means cozy. This is not cozy. And so, again, this is something that's very characteristic of Amsterdam and makes it a lovable place. They said, oh dear, we didn't really do the right thing. What can we do to rectify it? And there is this ability to say, okay, if we made a mistake, we should do something about it. And so what they're doing is a lot of infill, owner-occupied dwellings, more commercial establishments that had been almost entirely residential, better links to the rest of the city and to jobs. So it's an entire retrofit job. They've torn down some of the buildings, others they've simply sliced in half and freed up space that way. They've moved people, as you would put it, en bloc, so that there hasn't been displacement. This is a mega project. It's called Amsterdam Sweetus. It's a peripheral central business district. It started with very little planning, but the major banks in Amsterdam couldn't find sites in the center of the city. There was a great deal of historic preservation. So they built on the outskirts, but they built with relatively little planning, and it turned out to be a business district with no anything else, just pure 9 to 5 people. So now there's a major plan and divided by a highway and a railroad line. So now there's a plan to deck over the highway and the railroad line. What you're looking at is actually a cross-section of the deck. And by creating new land on top of it, making developable land, which theoretically, at any rate, developers will now pay the price of putting in all this infrastructure. But it's been, much of this development has been now stalled as a consequence of the global financial crisis and the lack of finance. Amsterdam is very devoted to bicycles. So the transportation problem within the city is mainly addressed through public transit and cycling. You don't want to drive a car within the center of Amsterdam, basically. Now, one of my arguments in my book and in other pieces I've written is that one can't simply say that what we need is a good process. One has to be concerned with the outcomes of process. But reciprocally, as Patsy Healy, a very well-known British planner, argues, social justice meant a concern not merely with the justice of outcomes, but also with the process through which policies are articulated and implemented. Now, I would say that the balance that you want to place between process and outcome depends on the particular context in which you're located. The United States now, planners having been thrashed for implementing plans that people didn't like, now say, oh, well, we won't tell you what to do at all. We'll simply focus on the process. And what we'll be is mediators, and everybody else should decide what should be done. And we'll just be there giving information and mediating among you. And all my students believe very strongly in participation. But they won't tell you what it is that they want the plan to look like, except that they're all for mixed use. But besides mixed use and sort of a Jane Jacobs view of the streetscape, they have very little concept of what the outcome should be. On the other hand, in Singapore, what you tend to get is a huge emphasis on what the outcome should be, and very little discussion of the process by which you get to it. And so I guess you would say that you want to come to move one way in one place and another way in the other. So why is it that there's been in the United States and in Europe such an emphasis on citizen participation? It was felt very much in the 1960s and 70s that bureaucracies ran roughshod over people, that they weren't responsive, that there were layers and layers, that nobody could make their voices heard. There were terms like internal colonialism, there were demands for community power, and it was thought that if communities had power, then you would see more equity, you would see redistribution towards low-income people. But in fact, what happened was that the demands by low-income communities tended to subside. And one of the things that made them subside in the United States was an absorption of representatives of those communities into the bureaucracies. In the 1960s, if you looked at New York City schools, there were no principals who were people of color, even though the people in the schools were predominantly people of color. Well, now everything has changed in that respect, and so there's been a subduing of the demands for community control by low-income communities, and community input has become a kind of routinized thing, which the stalwarts appear at meeting after meeting, and no one else very much bothers. So that my conclusion after watching, and my doctoral thesis, which was in 1971, was about community participation. Having watched community participation now for over 40 years, I would say that institutionalized citizen participation does have its purpose. It does provide local knowledge, it does force greater responsiveness, but that it doesn't necessarily produce more equitable outcomes. That community participation processes tend to be dominated by the most articulate, the most educated, and when you have situations where you have both homeowners and renters, by homeowners, well-to-do people tend to want to exclude poor people rather than to advocate for them. So it can lend itself very much to parochialism and, of course, also to corruption. There's this kind of feeling that people at the center can be corrupted by, say, big real estate operators, but people at the grassroots can be corrupted by small real estate operators. It's not as if the people, the grassroots, are somehow more pure than people at the top. Now, as well as participation, diversity, and that's since really Jane Jacobs' famous book on Death and Life of Great American Cities, diversity has become a watchword of planning, and planners advocate for diverse mixed-use kinds of projects, for social mix. Within philosophy and the humanities, there's been a great concern with the term that's used by philosophers is recognition, meaning that one should recognize and respect people who are different from oneself. And this fits into the argument for diversity. So neighborhoods should be diverse in terms of the ethnicities of people within them, the types of buildings, the types of uses. But there's a problem in terms of planning diversity, because that's an oxymoron. How do you, in fact, plan diversity when diversity is something which which is really organic in certain ways? The term simulacrum refers to a perfect copy of a non-existent original, your fantasy rather than the reality of what's out there. And so rather than a neighborhood being in any way really sort of natural and gritty or edgy, it simply becomes an imitation of that, a kind of Disney World. So that there's a problem because the market tends to drive out low-end uses, but planning has a great deal of difficulty in creating any kind of real diversity. Moreover, there's no necessary relationship between diversity and equity, that you can have a diverse but very poor neighborhood, that ensuring diversity doesn't ensure that everybody will get an equal or equitable share. And this comes out particularly in the question of where you locate social groups. So the crucial issue is a planning issue is whether or not you try to disperse poor people or people of color. So in Singapore, you have the ethnic integration policy, which says, never mind where it is, who you think you want to live with. Never mind if you think you want to live only with people like you. You're going to live according to your proportion in the population in HDB housing. On the other hand, the United States, having decided that having concentrations of people of the same impoverished class is a bad idea, they instituted a program called Moving to Opportunity, which said, we're not going to let you stay there. You're going to move out and be with people who are different from you. And so the coercion isn't saying that where they move out to should have a certain proportion of each kind of people, but it says the place they're moving from should not be disproportionately of one kind of person. And this has been, unsurprisingly, much contested. So how you deal with this issue, and I might add that in the United States, many ethnic enclaves have been very successful in terms of providing a way by which people can, in fact, achieve upward mobility, start businesses. And if you're, say, a Korean grocer, if you can't start your Korean grocery in some white suburb where nobody eats Korean food. You can only really have a successful Korean grocery where there are other Koreans. So how you deal with this issue of ethnic mix depends on who the ethnic groups are, depends on the particular social context in which you're operating. But I do recall last year when I was teaching here, there was a Nigerian woman in my class from Lagos. So when we were talking about the ethnic integration policy, she said, nobody's going to tell me where I'm going to live. Nobody's going to tell me who I can live next door to. This is really a bad idea. Now, this is a woman this was an African woman. Her identity was with her tribe, and she felt that, she said, I'm an Igbo and I want to live with other Igbos. It isn't that to us, probably as outsiders, we could distinguish, certainly on the basis of looks or language, what she was from other people who were of some other tribe in Lagos. So this is where people have very strong feelings, and it becomes very touchy for planners to become involved in telling people who they should live with. So what you see, the point in a way that I'm really getting at is that in all these broad areas, the values of equity, diversity, and democracy can be in conflict. They can be in contradiction. There isn't necessarily one right policy to follow. That depending on your particular context, on the particular historical moment, whatever the most just policy is indeterminate. At the same time, I think it is possible to specify criteria by which to evaluate policy, even while I can't stand here and say this is what you should particularly do when developing the cemetery in Singapore. One quotation I like from Lee Kuan Yew, which is right out of the argument that the turn of the 20th century economist Henry George made concerning value that's created by the community. Lee Kuan Yew said, "I saw no reason why private landowners should profit from an increase in land value brought about by economic development and the infrastructure paid for with public funds." So one could argue this is a real argument for equity. This says if the community creates value, the community should get that value back. So when we look at the development of HDB right in the core of Singapore, well, that's based on an argument that says that, in fact, the public should have access to the benefit of living in the core of Singapore. In contrast, the argument that was made in New York when they were developing Battery Park City is, well, they couldn't develop any housing there for low-income people because the land was so valuable that the thing to do was really to realize the most possible value from the land and then to use the money to build housing for low-income people somewhere where land was cheaper. But some kind of slip happened, and in fact, they built the high-income housing in Battery Park City, and they didn't use the proceeds to build housing where land was cheaper. I think that Singapore has a very strong outcome orientation. It retains this goal of keeping the great majority of the citizen, and it's important to say citizen, population in the public housing sector. Whereas other places, including Hong Kong, by the way, have lowered the income level at which you qualify for public housing, that Singapore has raised it, thereby enabling a very mixed income population to live in HDB buildings. So the Singapore system captures for the public much of the increments in the value of land. This was the case actually in Amsterdam as well until fairly recently. The land in Amsterdam and in Stockholm, likewise as in Singapore, is virtually all publicly owned. But there's been a greater and greater move towards market domination in those cities. So then I came up at the end of my book, and I don't want to read these all to you, but a bunch of general rules that one could use when evaluating development, so that all housing development should in fact provide some amount of affordable housing, even if you're building upper income condominiums. That involuntary relocation, so that people will be forced to live with people who aren't like them, is not really a very good idea, although I think maybe we could say that here it's worked better than one might expect. That economic development programs should not, one of the terms that used to be around was smokestack chasing. You just tried to get the wealthiest corporations to come by giving them big subsidies. that now it's less smokestacks and more financial industry, but that economic development programs should always be concerned with the interests of the employees, the workforce, and the owners of businesses. Then, I don't want to read all this, but basically what it really says is that you have to give heightened scrutiny to new development, to development which is getting any kind of public benefit, to make sure that ordinary people receive direct benefits from it. In the United States now, there are a number of cities which have required that any development, any commercial development, like a shopping mall, that receives a public subsidy should be required to pay a living wage, a decent wage, to all the employees in that complex. Transit fares are at the city level that policy which can most benefit low-income people, because low-income people are dependent on public transit. If they have very low transit fares, they can get to jobs, and it doesn't take that much of their income. On the other hand, suburban commuters who have high incomes could be charged more. What you see in American cities is that there's actually a much greater subsidy per person to well-to-do suburban communities on railroads than there are to urban residents using public transit. Then I would argue that planners, and this is more an American probably issue than here, but that planners should play a more active role than they have been doing lately in terms of pressing for more equitable outcomes. Zoning is one instrument that planning has, and it shouldn't be used to exclude people. On the other hand, you shouldn't necessarily say that people can't live together who are of the same ethnic group, but if you do that, you have to make sure that there's access for others into their spaces, and in general, and this is one of the places where I think Singapore does very well, in providing ample public space that's widely accessible and provides varied kinds of activities within it. Democracy is something that we always are for, but how you actually do it matters a lot. So planning has to be developed, I think, in consultation with target populations, and one of the issues I see in Singapore is there's a great deal of public discussion about planning at, you might say, the macro level. The population white paper has certainly gotten plenty of press and plenty of discussion, but the involvement of target populations in specific places that are being redeveloped is less open. Then there's the problem of, well, how do you have democracy for areas where nobody's living yet, where you're building a new town, for example? If no one's there, who are the people that you should get involved? It's hard to get people involved if they don't have what they identify as a direct interest in the place. But nevertheless, one can attempt, in fact, to have broad consultation by representatives of groups, especially nonprofit, non-governmental organizations that aren't in the affected area. One of the issues, which, as I said at the beginning, maybe is less of one here than in most every place else in the world, is that at the urban level, you're limited by what the national level does. One of the reasons Amsterdam could be so egalitarian was because the Dutch welfare state basically supported most of the budget of the city of Amsterdam. So if you don't have a lot of money coming down to you from the national state, it becomes difficult to carry out redistributive programs. Nevertheless, you still can, at the local level, be concerned with equitable outcomes from any of your policies, with having an open society, of not being exclusionary. The EU uses this term social exclusion a lot, and not excluding, but in fact being transparent, being open to the viewpoints of currently excluded groups is important. most important, I think, is changing the discourse that surrounds policymaking right now. That within neoliberalism, as it's called, within the constraints of a globalized economy where one simply hears all the time, when we must compete, we must promote economic development, that the cause of justice tends to be swept away. It becomes sort of embarrassing to say, oh, well, that's not just, that's not equitable. It makes you seem sort of weak-willed or not part of the competition. As we see rankings of everything, it's a matter of becoming a winner. But you can't look at a place and say it's a single thing and it can be a winner or a loser. What you have to do is look at the people within the place and the quality of life that the people within that place have, so that even if you rank number one as the financial capital of the world, it doesn't mean that the people within that place, within New York or within London, necessarily benefit from being number one. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. We've now come to the Q&A session. Please state your name and organization before asking your question, and you may use the microphones along the aisles as well. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Susan. That was really one of the most enjoyable lectures I sat through, not only because I agreed with everything you said. Just on your last point, I was reminded of when you talked about competitiveness doesn't necessarily trickle down, and the economic benefits don't necessarily trickle down to benefit all the city's residents. I was reminded of Martin Luther King's famous quote about how the arc of history is long, but it bends towards justice. Hopefully, right? Maybe you can start the Q&A rolling by asking, I mean, you had a point about how we were strong in terms of outcomes, but probably weaker in terms of democratic processes. And there are many planners in the room, so I'm going to put them in the spot by, or rather I'm going to put you in the spot by telling them why you think, you can't argue with success, right? You can't argue with good performance. And for a long time now, this place has been run on the basis of performance legitimacy. What you're really saying is that you also need procedural and systemic legitimacy. So why is that democratic process, that engagement and inclusion and participation by citizens critical?
Well, what I say is that the legitimacy of the Singaporean government and of the PAP in particular has come from what seems like enormous success. But okay, now you're here. You've got what you've got. You've got good housing, you've got nice parks, you've got a well-functioning transit system. So what next? And how do you maintain legitimacy? Well, I don't think, given that you now have a highly educated population, that you can maintain legitimacy by simply saying, okay, these are the next 7 things we're going to do for you. That people's willingness to accept this government comes from feeling, well, we've done so much better than our parents or our grandparents. But probably the next generation is not going to feel that they did so much better than their parents and their grandparents. It's going to be a much more stable, high consumption society. And at that point, what people want may become less tangible. Instead, it's feelings of ownership of the society.
Okay, why don't I open it up to the floor? Any questions? Jan?
Yes, my name is Jan. Sorry, that's quick. Jan Vosbinder, and I'm the director of the Complexity Program at NTU. And I'd like to start with I'm Dutch.
I was going to ask if you were Dutch.
So I'd like to start to compliment you with the excellent presentation on Amsterdam in particular. That's the one I can check in the sense that I can feel it. It's very seldom that you hear somebody so precisely describe Amsterdam in such beautiful words and so true. So thank you very much for that. Now, being the director of a complexity center means that you have almost unlearned to ask simple questions. And so maybe my question may be a little convoluted in many ways, but I'll try to do it anyway. The essence of complexity in many ways is to find the more in the sentence, the whole is more than the sum of its parts. And in planning, and I should say that more comes basically from interactions between those parts. And those interactions are very difficult to understand often, or to find the basic principles of that. Now, if you talk about planning the way you did, the way I understood it, anyway you did, you try to achieve intangibles by planning tangibles. And at the same time, and you do that by planning tangibles and by planning a process to achieve those tangibles. And so the process is not the same as the interactions that after you've achieved whatever you wanted to achieve actually take care of forming the character that comes out of a city. And that character may not be at all what you wanted to plan the same in the beginning. So it's not really a question, it's a question for you to reflect on what I say, whether I make sense what I'm saying and whether or not. I'm not quite sure, but these were the thoughts that came up in my mind when I listened to you.
Okay.
Before you answer, Susan, just add on to that, which is that same thoughts I had, Yen, when I was listening to you speak, which is that planners often get it wrong. I mean, in the 50s, we thought Brasilia would be great, right? We drove past Chinatown just now, and you very diplomatically refused to answer my question on whether we got it right. So what advice would you give planners given the inherent complexity and unpredictability and unintended consequences of planning?
Okay, I'd say that planners got a great deal wrong in the post-war period, and we're living with a lot of what they got wrong, particularly the popularity of the Corbusian model. Actually, one of the things I found enlightening in a way about Singapore is it's the only place where I've seen that model actually work in more or less the way that he had wanted, so it doesn't seem as wrong as it always previously had seemed to me. But the example that I gave of the Bijlmermeer outside of Amsterdam, where they got it wrong, and they knew they got it wrong, and so they tried to figure out what they could do to correct it. One of the things that has changed, I think, in terms of an understanding of planning is that you don't have a plan and you say, okay, that's the plan and we're never going to deviate from it, but that you have to, in fact, constantly reinvent the plan and respond as you go along to what seems wrong. And in fact, they could have responded a lot earlier to what seemed to be wrong in the Bijlmermeer instead of waiting till they accommodated 60,000 people and then decided that they had to redo it. But part of the reason why there have been so many demands for the democratization of planning was because, in fact, so much was gotten wrong, and particularly the destruction of heritage sites, so that it was the preservationist movement more than anything that was the counter to mistakes that were made by planners. But I want to go to another aspect of your question about complexity, which is that what you see is as you get to the next stage, contradictions arise that didn't previously exist. That might be a kind of Marxian argument, but that the contradiction that now exists in Singapore of having a highly educated population, which is much less willing to accept planners telling them what to do, is a result of planning which said we have to create a highly educated population. So in a way, it's come back, and that will inevitably happen. That will always happen, that what works at one time is not going to be the right thing to do at another time. Again, the Amsterdam example, the idea of the compact city. Well, no, first was the idea of overflow, so you build all these new towns, and so then they said, oh my God, nobody's living in Amsterdam anymore, and so then we must have the compact city, but now what people see as the appropriate spatial planning is the multinodal city, and so each might have been appropriate for a particular time, but not later.
The gentleman over there.
That's Kai, it's his name. Yeah.
Thanks. Thanks, Susan. That was most instructive. I think you stressed the process very much, but you didn't really talk about the length of the process. As I recall, it took the Dutch, I think, 20 years to agree that they had made a mistake in Bijlmermeer. And very often one says, justice delayed is justice denied. So the question becomes, how can we balance the need for the outcome with the need for the process? And what is an appropriate balance at that stage? Sorry, my name is Kai Axhausen. I'm at ETH Zurich and now at the Future Cities Laboratory here in Singapore.
Yeah, well, time time is always a big question in terms of planning. What developers will say is, we can't wait around while you're fiddling with these plans and we're borrowing money and every month we're paying interest and you're sitting in some room debating on what should be appropriate. On the other hand, things that are done in haste are often big mistakes too. And so I'm not sure one can make any general statement on this subject. What I've seen in terms of looking at mega projects and why I think that mega projects for the most part are not such a great idea is that inevitably they take so long to come to completion that at least once and often twice during their history they fall apart, they go bankrupt, it goes into administration, and that a more incremental process of development might in many cases be a better process of development than saying we're going to do it all at once.
So mega projects, besides being inequitable, you much prefer evolutionary, incremental, adaptive, learn by doing approach. Other questions? The gentleman in front.
Hi, I'm Dikshan from NUS. My question now is, I understand from the lecture is when we are talking about people that are the different ethnic group, and also we are talking about the working and the rich and the poor. But this time around, we are facing problems like aging populations. So are there any processes that you can share with us that how are we going to deal with this type of planning for aging population? Because there are going to be one big group of people that will be in the city. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a touchy topic, not just here, but in the United States, where there's a big debate now about whether the so-called entitlement programs, Social Security and Medicare programs for, the elderly, can, quote, still be afforded. And there are two ways of looking at that. One is that, of course, they can be afforded. It just simply means that people who have a lot have to be taxed more. And, of course, they don't like it and they bring pressure against it. But in terms of Singapore, there's a fairly obvious remedy to your aging problem, which is to allow more immigration. But, of course, and it's, to me, rather odd being an American because, of course, we've allowed enormous amounts of immigration and have managed to accommodate ourselves to it. And the Americans call themselves a nation of immigrants. Well, Singapore is also a nation of immigrants. It's somewhat puzzling to me that there's so much antagonism to the idea of letting in the next generation of immigrants. I think that the level of immigration of people who can actually become permanent residents and citizens could be substantially higher than what's currently being called for, while on the other hand, the number of people who are so-called foreign workers, that is, who have no rights, could be lessened. And speaking of contradictions, of course, the greatest contradiction right now in Singapore is the very large and presumably greatly increasing number of people that you wish to admit who don't exist. That is, they exist to sweep your floors or clean your parks, but they don't exist in terms of having places to live, if you look at the land use plan. So that in the desire to not increase the core population, it means that in order to provide the services that are expected, you increase this population, which are people who don't have rights, and how you can say that they can simply be excluded from society is a question, certainly a question of equity.
Yeah, I'm taken from the Sports Council, and I love your comments because I'm currently helping to manage one of the mega projects. And I can understand what you're saying. But, in the last question and in your answer, you inevitably are alluding to the unique circumstances we find ourselves in as being a city-state. And a highly educated population wants to have the ability and opportunity to make choices. And we were told just before the election in a book that was published called The Hard Truths, that the situation we find ourselves in as a city-state has certain realities, particularly a city-state of this size, has certain realities that we have to acknowledge. So these come to clash and are at attention even as we try to compare ourselves with the other cities. we're actually in certain senses not comparable. So the tensions continue to exist and the dilemmas we face are real. So the question lies in inevitably coming down to trying to ask the question, what is our identity?
Yeah, I was going to ask exactly the same question. I mean, you look around the world, there's essentially three models of immigration. There's the Dubai model, where the foreigners are really treated not even as citizens, they have no rights. Then you have the European model. Even you had acknowledged that in Amsterdam, in Germany, they struggle with absorbing and assimilating their, Muslim immigrants. And then I guess the only successful model of immigration is the US, which is an immigrant nation.
Australia is even
Well,
more.
have you seen
Canada.
Julia Gillard's comments this morning, right? If you want to come here, you learn the Australian way, not the other way around. So given that the fact that we are not just a city, but a state in a city, should we be more nuanced, realistic about how successful we can be absorbing, accepting, assimilating our immigrants?
Well, I'm not sure that being a city-state makes it any more difficult. I mean, being a city-state, you don't have many of the kinds of conflicts that other places have between urban and rural populations, which which everywhere are a very major problem. The EU wrestles with agricultural policy constantly. In the United States, it's rural interests that keep these huge agricultural subsidies and generally block anything that benefits cities. So you have a different set of problems. But I don't see why being a city-state should make you less open to immigration. It could just as well make you more open to immigration. It's a hard problem anywhere because people tend to say, well, I got here and now pull up the drawbridge. But that's a self-interested kind of statement. Canada, which for a very long time was very restrictive in its immigration policy, has now been very much more open and in fact has been quite successful in it. Vancouver is a city that's now virtually an Asian city. Toronto has a vast array of ethnic groups. So that I'm just not sure what the distinction is that says, well, it's so much harder if you're a city-state than if you're a big country.
City-state trying to be a nation, I think that's our...
Well...
And because nationhood is tied up with notions of land and identity and... but I agree with you, the economic benefits of immigration are almost indisputable, right?
Well, I would think that given that you have three major ethnic groups in the core population, that you can figure out an immigration policy which the US one gives priority to relatives of already existing people, of citizens. So people here must have relatives who are in the mainland China or mainland India, or, so people who are brought in that way, yes, you can require people to learn the language, to pass a citizenship test. The US has a citizenship test. You can demand loyalty, but it doesn't mean that you just keep people out because you want to keep people out.
Yeah, I see the inclusion point. Maybe John first, then the gentleman there, then Lily.
Wow, we placed it to two S's this week, Saskia and yourself.
Yeah, Saskia.
There's a common comment about being competitive in the end game. I like that comment. Okay, I'm John. I'm an unusual character in the room because I'm not a planner. I'm actually an immigrant from the third largest island in the world. Now you go figure which island I'm from. Not Singapore, not Sentosa, not Pulau Ubin. I think we have tried to be sensitive to many words you talk about, but two words I want to talk to you about today is you mentioned context and indeterminate. I think in our way of doing the planning here, we try to be contextual. Whether we're successful, not so, that is the verdict is still, I think. And we're also very aware of being indeterminate about the processes, the philosophy, and the policy. By that I mean, I hope you're aware of the two things that I'm pretty sure you're aware of because you seem to know everything about Singapore. The first thing is the en bloc scheme, which is a disaster. because it was so quickly hatched and it was just put through the legislation that nobody knew what it was. Okay? We can have a conversation on that. Now, the second thing that came along, I thought was a lot more sensible. It's called a SEARS.
What's that called? What?
It's called a Selected En Bloc Redevelopment Scheme. To you, I thought it would be interesting because it's about redevelopment. That means going back into brownfield in the existing community, reorganizing structure. We're not very good at it yet, but there's one element that introduced there, which is different from En Bloc that I like, is that they introduced that element that if I come in to redevelop the area, the existing community has a first choice to choose a unit to live in the same place, which I thought was a great improvement from the en bloc. So I like your comment on that. Now, the other thing I like your comment
John,
is...
John, can you get to the question, please?
Oh, so no, I like to, I like your comment. Okay, maybe I ask you a question. I have a pet theory. And we have a problem now, is that for a long, long time, there's a maxim that we all believe in, right? Physical planning, infrastructure planning is easy and fast. But the social cultural development of society is always way, way behind. I think in Singapore, the inflection has happened. The problem is that because it's a global city, you find that the rate of social, cultural, intellectual development in the society is now at different paces. And the paces are not in line with the physical, infrastructural development. So I think that's where the angst is happening now, because I think a lot of people just homogenize Singaporean. I don't think that's the case. It's a very diversified group of people. You have the very intellectually, superly cultivated people down to the top, right? So I think when you put it under an island of this size, that's where the tension comes in, I think. So I think this could be the problem that the policymaker has really understand and addressed, because I don't think I have heard it verbalized before. Thank you.
Thanks, John.
I think it was a rhetorical question.
The gentleman over there first, then I'll come to you, sir.
Good afternoon. Thank you for the wonderful presentation. My name is Joseph Teo. I'm the Center Director for the Singapore E-Government Leadership Center at the National University of Singapore. So I just have very intriguing question. The story of New Market very much intrigued me. On two counts. One, you mentioned that there were big protests and everything. The question there would be, what was the factor that urban planners didn't consider that caused such a big protest? In other words, what is this thing that urban planners should clearly there's something that the citizens had a strong feeling for that wasn't considered by urban planners, and what might this factor be, and essentially what motivated those protests? And then the second is, could you suggest a different way of communicating with urban planners, something better than getting hit on the head by police? Yeah, thank you.
Well, the analogous conflict here would have been the one over the National Library. That is, people in Amsterdam liked this area and they didn't want to see it torn down. The planners had been educated very much in the modernist school of planning, which was the idea that you produced buildings that let in lots of light and air, that you built roads so that people could get places quickly. And it was a whole post-war era where the emphasis was on mobility and decentralization and deconcentration. They looked at this old building and they said, well, why bother? These are old buildings that rehabilitating them was very expensive. It would be much cheaper to tear them down and build new. And anyhow, they were inadequate in many ways. And so their criteria of what should matter was completely different from the criteria of the ordinary Amsterdammers of what should matter. They didn't bother to inquire, or they basically thought that people were too ignorant to know what was good for them. And so they would do it and show people that they would really like it when it was done.
Sir, we'll take the gentleman and Lily together.
Thank you. My name's John Argyle from a London-based think tank called Bright Blue. Professor, you concluded your slides by arguing that there are obvious limits to what can be achieved at the metropolitan level. But looking at London and the UK, it strikes me that the extent to which budgetary and political power is devolved to the metropolitan level, the local metropolitan level, is in itself a national policy choice. So, and I think that can change, because if you look at the current British government, one of their core policy objectives is all about trying to devolve power from the central down to the local. So I'd be interested if you had any remarks or you've done any analysis on the relationship between some of the outcomes that you're looking at, like equity, diversity, and democracy, and the extent to which power is devolved to the metropolitan level.
It so happens that I have a lot to say about it, probably too much. But having actually studied London extensively for a lot of time, what you see is the shifting back and forth. Being a city-state means that you don't have this constant tension as between the national level and the local level that you have in the US, but certainly have in the UK. So when Margaret Thatcher didn't like power being devolved to the Greater London Council, she said, okay, no more Greater London Council, and she simply got rid of it. And that during the Thatcher period, there was relatively little power at the local level. Then, really under Labour, there was substantial decentralization and the creation of the London mayoral office, and now there is more power at that level, but it still all depends on how budgetary allocations are done at the national level. That you can say, oh, well, we'll give power to the local level, but unless you actually say that the local level can get this big budgetary pass-through and then decide itself what it's going to do with it, that you're not really decentralizing power. Now, I did a case study of Crossrail, which is this railroad currently being built across London, and the National Treasury, the Treasury opposed it for a very long time as being too expensive. And eventually they managed to get a bunch of people who did cost-benefit analysis to come up with an analysis. First, it only came up with a ratio of benefits to cost of 1.7, and Treasury said no. So then they went back to the computers and they came up with 2.3. So at that point, Treasury said yes. And so they are now building Crossrail. But I interviewed in connection with that Ken Livingston, who had been the mayor at the time the approval was done, and he said, the only way I could sell it was through convincing the national government that it would make London more competitive. That I had to say it was competitive, that it was going to produce economic development, that it was going to actually make life much better for people in London who would have access to better transit, persuaded no one. That simply didn't matter. And so it wasn't up to the people in London what they wanted in terms of their transit system. It was very much up to the national government. And in terms of budgetary allocations, that's what really matters. Amsterdam had as much equity and autonomy as it had because 90% of its budget actually came from the national government, and they pretty much said it could spend it as it will. So being a city-state is really advantageous in this respect, for sure.
Lily? No, this Lily first, and then the gentleman there.
Hi, I'm Lily Song, and I'm an adjunct researcher with CLC. And thank you, first of all, for an illuminating presentation. So as an urban scholar, you lay out these three axes of a just city. And then when we look at these three cases that you've described, it seems that whenever people in the city get close to sort of realizing democracy, diversity, or equity, that social movements and civil society has been involved. So, whether it's by exerting political pressure on policymakers in the private sector or, co-creating, so to speak, right, with the High Line. And I don't know the Amsterdam example as well, but in New York, a lot of sort of these, I guess, progressive planning policies have, from my understanding, resulted from sort of communities organizing and sort of, voicing their alternative visions of urban development. And then in Singapore, you attribute a quote to Lee Kuan Yew, affiliated with the Land Acquisition Act, and so with the PAP and Lee Kuan Yew sort of riding into power during a time of student organizing, labor organizing in the 50s and 60s, anti-colonialism, and then having this democratic mandate to deliver, right? So to get to my question, so now arriving at Singapore today, right, where we have a very high Gini coefficient, and at the same time we have civil society that's becoming more active. So recently we had the event at Hong Lim Square. Can you comment on sort of how you see the relationship between the development of civil society in a social and economic sense in Singapore and the potentials for a just city in Singapore?
I don't know if I want to go there. First of all, civil society can be a positive progressive force, or it can be a reactionary negative force. So the anti-immigrant sentiment that you get in, say, Denmark or Holland or in Arizona are, I would say, retrogressive movements. So I'm never going to say, oh, urban social movements are the way in which we're going to get equity. That some have that as their aim, and others have as their aim exclusion. One of the problems in terms of public participation in the active civil society in the United States is it tends to be well-to-do groups that are the most active and have the most access. So I guess I have to say that it all depends. In Singapore, I think it would be the case that more civil society activity would be a good thing. But it wouldn't necessarily produce more equity. The preservationism, which is always the favorite middle-class aim of local movements, is not going to produce a low Gini coefficient, and in fact it may simply produce more gentrification. When you look at another example, San Francisco, the movement to save San Francisco's Victorian homes was very much a middle-class movement, primarily, and it was quite a bit of gay movement. Well, they saved the middle-class home, or the Victorian homes, but those homes now sell for $8-10 million, maybe now $20 million. So that it depends on what the particular group in civil society is aiming at, whether or not it's going to produce a more equitable outcome. But I would say that a more active civil society is in itself a desirable goal.
Yeah, somebody mentioned to me that the people fighting for the preservation of Bukit Brown, none of them have their grandparents or their great-grandparents buried there.
Buried there.
The gentleman over there, then the lady in front.
I'm Tan Shi Tiong. I'm an architect and town planner. I want to clarify that I'm a town planner in private practice, so I'm not involved in the white papers at all. By saying that, I also like to say that in the 70s, I did my town planning thesis in London. So I studied the biker wall in Newcastle, designed by the Danish architect Ralph Erskine. So he has a bottom-up approach by immersing in the community and to help build a first sort of a community-participated housing in Newcastle. On the other hand, the other case study in London showed that in Notting Hill, there was this civil rights movement. And the leader of it, although managed to get the citizens, many are ethnic blacks and so on, to participate, but ultimately we found that he has a political agenda. So that was the conclusion of my thesis, that many participations are not actually genuine. Now coming back to Singapore, you said we are strong in outcome and we are weak in process. Now I'm now training, I'm semi-retired, I'm now training mayors and party secretaries from China who come here to learn our governance and town planning. Now they are very interested in public participation, and I'm very ashamed to tell them that we really have not much to teach you in Singapore. But I cited two examples. 10 years ago, I was involved in the concept plan, Singapore 2011 concept plan focus group. So I was president of Institute of Planners. I was very glad to be put together with the Nature Society, our NGO, to put up a paper to persuade government to put aside a planned new town in Pulau Ubin. And the Nature Society did a very good biodiversity survey, and it was very convincing. Quietly, that report was submitted to the ministry. The ministry accepted it and stopped the 65,000 neighborhood in our only native island of Pulau Ubin. Now, the other example is last year, Bukit Brown, you just mentioned, okay? That was approached in a totally different case. Civil societies came onto the press, make a big, loud announcement, taking their stand and so on. So as a result, I believe perhaps the result was not that good. And eventually there was a compromise by building a bridge and so on. But still, out of the 80,000 graves, nearly 1,000 graves have been assumed or removed. Now, I want to ask you, in the Singapore context, perhaps you're quite familiar with our governance and political system, what is the best way to achieve the outcome through what process? Thank you.
That's your next book.
Well, I guess that you have to, in cases like that, come to some kind of agreement or compromise. And I don't know enough about the particular cemetery case to really come to a very strong conclusion. My feeling is that it's less important than some others, and that it is an example of the kind of thing that gets middle-class people very excited, which is issues of preservation. And I think preservation is a nice goal, that people care about it, that in a democratic society you really try to preserve those places that people value, but that I don't see it as having a great deal to do, in fact, with equity. But in itself, and it's one of the arguments in itself for greater democracy, which is to say that if there are places that people really care about, then you need to consult them instead of saying, well, it's for your own good and forget about what you think.
The lady?
Hi, my name is Bhavani Prakash. I run a green jobs portal called Green Color Asia, and also a public advocacy site called Eco Walk the Talk, where we have featured Bukit Brown. So my question is, I'm a PR here. I've been here for 9 years. And I get a sense from the people I talk to, my friends, neighbors, that it's not so much an anti-foreigner feeling, but a sense that this vision of Singapore has not been co-creative. It's not been a consultative process. There has been an effort in that direction through our Singapore conversation, in which I've participated as a participant, as a co-facilitator as well. But that process has been going on. But suddenly the white paper came out of the blue, where this population figure popped out. And that has not been a consultative process. So on the one hand, we get the sense that the government is trying to make it inclusive, but on the other hand, they're going ahead with what they want to do. The feeling I also get on the ground, I talk to taxi drivers, bus drivers. I'm on the MRT, and off late, I hear the word 6.9 billion pop out randomly while I'm traveling on train, especially peak time going back, is that the government hasn't handled the current population to satisfaction, which is buses are getting overcrowded, MRTs are getting overcrowded, cost of living is getting higher, public housing is becoming more expensive, and also jobs, the fear that their children may not be able to get jobs, people aren't, fresh graduates aren't getting jobs. Concern about heritage, is there being priority for preservation of heritage and ecological preservation as well. So all these issues, if they're not currently being resolved, there is concern about this future higher figure. So I agree, you say process is important. So how can it be made more inclusive? And this is a question that has popped up quite often.
Yeah, well, one of the problems, you had an organization, but there aren't that many organizations, my feeling is, like your organization here. And if you're going to have an inclusive process, you have to have groups that represent people that you can include. And the absence of a very thick civil society makes it difficult to have an inclusive process. Clearly, their number of 6.9 million was a big strategic mistake. They should never, ever have mentioned a number. But to me, the biggest issue is not how many people should be added to the core population and whether if you added 25,000 more than the 25,000 they recommended, that somehow you'd lose a sense of nationhood, but is really the foreign workers who nobody is proposing at all of giving them a path to PR or to citizenship. And you have to, if you're going to be willing to, or if you wish to reduce the number of people here, then you're going to have to be willing to give up some of the cheap services that everybody here takes for granted. That you might have to wash your own clothes, for example. That people in Singapore live somewhat of the level, or many people do, of the way the colonials lived when they were here. The idea seems to be kind of what the British upper class thought was a nice way of life. That in other places it costs a very large sum of money to get your clothes laundered or dry cleaned, to have somebody clean your house, to have a nanny. And that you're going to have to change the cost structure of Singapore if, in fact, you're going to not extend the population so much. After all, the big increase in the population is, in fact, the generic workers, not the ones who are supposed to become Singaporeans.
Well, I think we've almost run out of time. I think sometimes it really takes a foreign expert who knows us well, means well for us, to crystallize the choices for us and to really illuminate the issues. So please join me in thanking Professor Susan Fainstein for this excellent talk.
Thank you, Professor Fainstein and Donald, for a very interesting session. May I now invite Mr. Khoo Teng Chai, Executive Director of CLC, to present tokens of appreciation. Right, thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, we've come to the end of today's lecture. Thank you for your participation, and do join us for the next upcoming lecture in March with Dr. Liu Taike, who'll be speaking on his experiences in developing the Singapore housing scene. We will also be seeking your feedback via email, so we would appreciate if you take a minute to tell us how to improve this lecture series. So have a good evening, and we'll look forward to seeing you again. Thank you.